Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are honored to be gathered with y'all virtually and in person tonight to celebrate Black folk, the roots of the Black working class. It is a brand new book by Blair LM Kelley, and she's here in conversation with Bettina L. Love. This book has come on in, folks. This book spans 200 years from one of Dr. Kelley's earliest known ancestors, an enslaved blacksmith, to the essential workers of the COVID-19 pandemic. It highlights the lives of the laundresses, Pullman porters, domestic maids, and postal workers who established the Black working class as a force in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We are really, really excited to be here with all of you, and I'm going to introduce Dr. Bettina L. Love first. Dr. Love is the William F. Russell Professor at Teachers College at Columbia University and the best-selling author of We Want to Do More Than Survive. In 2022, the Kennedy Center named Dr. Love one of the next 50 leaders making the world more inspired, inclusive, and compassionate. A co-founder of the Abolitionist Teaching Network, whose mission is to develop and support teachers and parents fighting injustice within their schools and communities, they've granted over $250,000 to abolitionists across the country. We are very excited about Dr. Love's forthcoming book, Punished for Dreaming: How School Reform Harms Black Children and How We Heal. You can join us in celebration of that book coming up on September 30th at Auburn Avenue Research Library. We will be launching the book. We are so honored to get to do that. You can pre-order it now. Go ahead and do it. Go ahead and click it. But the woman of the hour tonight is Dr. Blair LM Kelley, who is an award-winning author, historian, and scholar of the African American experience. A dedicated public historian, Kelley works to amplify the histories of Black people, chronicling the everyday impact of their activism. She is the Joel R. Williamson Distinguished Professor of Southern Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the incoming director of the Center for the Study of the American South. She is the first Black woman to serve in that role in the center's 30-year history. She is the author of 2 books. The first, Right to Ride, Streetcar Boycotts, and African American Citizenship, was awarded the 2010 Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book Prize from the Association of Black Women Historians, which chronicles the little-known Black men and women who protested the passage of laws segregating trains and streetcars at the turn of the century. And her newest book, which we are celebrating tonight, is Black Folk, the Roots of the Black Working Class. So we are super excited to kick this off, and I just want to let folks know, both y'all who are physically here with us and folks who are watching online, you can ask questions, and I'll bring the mic around for folks who are here, and folks who are in the chat, we will vocalize your questions so that everyone can participate. But without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Dr. Bettina Love to get this party started. So welcome, everybody.
Thank y'all for coming out tonight. For those at home watching, what's up? I am just so honored that you asked me to do this. Just a little bit about Blair before we get into the book. A wonderful, amazing historian, an amazing daughter, an amazing human being, and funny as hell. And I'm just really honored to share space with you. I got an early copy of this book to read. It's tabbed up. But it was just such a gorgeous read.
Thank you.
Because it showed us how much you love Black people.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I want to do, I want to start with how you love Black people in this book.
All right.
And read a little bit on page 14.
Okay.
Because you say something that really struck me when I started to read the book. You say, I'm Northern born, but raised by Southern born working class people. Mm-hmm. And I felt that deeply. Mm-hmm. Because I Googled our grandmothers. Yes. And so your grandmother's from South Carolina. Yes. My grandmother's from South Carolina, right? Yes. And they grew up about 2 hours away from each other in South Carolina. But I was raised in upstate New York, right? The Rock, baby. And I tell people all the time, even though I grew up in upstate New York, I got Southern sensibilities.
Absolutely.
And what does that mean? And so you start to talk about the beauty of Black folks. So you can start anywhere you want on page 14, but I think I'm the descendant, and that just gets going.
Okay. Oh, okay. I am the descendant of enslaved people who labored in Georgia, Virginia, South Carolina, and Maryland. I am northern born, but raised by southern born working class people. My relationship to these stories is not as a sociologist or only as a historian, but as a member of the family. You want me to keep going?
Keep going. You about to break it down.
My invocation of Black folk is the feel of fuzzy string beans in the hand of my grandmother, in my hand, as my grandmother recalled how she learned to pick them without hurting the plants themselves back in Newberry, South Carolina. I learned the folk in the rhythm of the chatter of women gathered in the churchyard for what felt like hours. My grandmother and her deaconess, all white, sharing laughs and raised eyebrow looks under the brim of her hat, as well as insights and ideas under the shade of the big oak tree. My Black folk is the smell of roasted salt pork stewing in the pot liquor of my grandmother's turnip greens as I nestled against her round hip as she stood on line to serve mourners in the church basement during the repast. Her lessons of independence, community wisdom, and service are how I first came to know myself. Black folk is what my community calls itself, the joy in our connection, our coming together, my people.
That's just gorgeous.
Thank you.
And it brought back so many memories. When you said my grandmother in the all-white deaconess.
And I'm an all-white deaconess.
Oh.
I think I might be fourth generation deaconess, but I'm definitely third generation.
Oh, you're
on
not
both
playing.
sides.
You're not playing on both sides.
On both sides.
Okay, so let's get into it. What made you want to write this book? Where did these stories start to come from? Where are you pulling this stuff from?
So the book started with, the press being interested in like, what is the Black working class? And to answer that question, I couldn't just do something technical. I couldn't just think about it without thinking about my people and where I come from. And my mother had always told me stories. She was what would now be considered an older, but not now, then considered an older parent. She was the oldest mother on the birthing ward at the time. And now would have just been a mom. But she felt that time distance between the two of us. And she wanted me to know where she was from and the things that she experienced in her lifetime. So she fed them to me and always repeated them to the point where I'd be like, Mommy, I know that story. And she's like, well, anyway. And she would tell it again and again and again. So when it came time for me to write this book, her stories came flooding back to me. And I was like, this is how I'll talk about what it means. And this is how I'll embody and personify the humanness that I want to talk about in Black life. Because I really love Black people and I enjoy being around Black people. And so often we talk about what is wrong and what is difficult and how others treat us. But I'm not a historian of how others treat us. I'm a historian of the Black experience. And to center it and to really get the chance to talk about it, it was a special opportunity.
Oh, I love that. So let's talk about how you define, because there's this idea of the working class, the white working class, but then there's the Black working class. What I love that you do in the book is not just about their labor, it's about the way they build community, the way they love. So talk to us about that.
So much of like labor history, and labor historians are going to get sick of me on this book tour because I'm going to say I'm not a labor historian. But I'm not a labor historian because oftentimes when you read labor history, it started at the work site on the factory floor. And there was an organizer coming and they were from these sets of letters and they were arguing with the people from that sets of letters. And I couldn't read it because I was like, well, I had to keep going back to the front to remember what the letters stood for and when they broke up and when they fought about this and that. And it just never felt like the people I knew or the issues that they had. I know Union history is extremely important and important to trace, but here I really wanted to make us know the human worker, make us know the person in community, make us know if they changed jobs, we would still care about them because they were so relevant to our story. So that whole being And the question of how they came to be who they were
Yeah.
was really my question.
Because I love that you say that we're not just descendants of Black folks, we're descendants of Black working class folks.
Yeah.
And I
Most
think,
of us are.
yes. And I
Mhm.
think about my life. I think about all the teachers and all the postal workers
Mm-hmm.
and all the folks who had these jobs, who put food on the table every single day.
Mhm.
But what I love that you do is you talk about how they were strategic, how they were thoughtful, how they fought for what they knew was right, which at the end of the day is what all workers want.
Yes.
So you say, I got my notes in my book, in my phone. You talk about this idea. Well, first let's back up because there's somebody that you mentioned that I just love, but I want to know how they influence your work, and that's Zora Neale Hurston.
I love Zora Neale Hurston.
I could tell by reading this book.
And I could just read her at any time. And she just cracks me up because she's funny and she's evil and snarky and just all the good things at the same time. And I ran into the trails of her as I was doing this work because I use a WPA interview, which I like rip up for fun in one of the chapters. And she was so critical of the particularities of capturing Black life that were not the ways in which a wider world wanted to pay attention to us. But she really foresaw the importance of that work. And so to shout her out, to include her washerwoman story, which is a great story.
Yes, it is.
Tells you so much. And so her voice, her approach, and her care about the particularities is what I really love. I mean, she thinks all kinds of things in her lifetime, but I think mostly she thinks about Black people.
Yeah. All right. So you talk on page 74 about what a working class is, like the mobility, the independence, the solidarity.
And it's right at the page after my favorite sentence in the whole book.
Okay, well let's do it all. Let's do it all. Let's go to 74. Let's do your favorite
72, bottom of 72.
Okay, 72
to 73.
Okay.
And I'll just read the first like 3 sentences right there.
Yeah.
Invisible to Hornsby. Hornsby is the white WPA interviewer that goes to interview a washerwoman and misnames her, misunderstands her, and judges her. Invisible to Hornsby were the skills that Sarah possessed. Sarah knew how to put the wind to work, how to make soap rise from ashes and grease, how to make industrial refuse into washpots and fire, how to take hold of hot iron to smooth and not to burn, how to make the white people's filthy things bright and white like new. This knowledge wasn't innate. These skills were her inheritance from her sisters, both in blood and in community, passed down from woman to woman, working shoulder to shoulder in concert with one another.
And this is Athens.
This is Athens.
Right, you're talking about Athens, Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
So as we're here in Atlanta, let's just talk about some of the stories that you bring out in this book that are Georgia. So talk about Sarah a little bit and who she is.
So Sarah is a woman who gets encountered by this WPA interviewer who's unemployed and sent out to gather the stories of enslaved people who are older, and then, folks who capture the character of, Negro life. And she talks about Sarah in like these really stereotypical ways. And so the interaction between the two women gives me a chance to think about, well, what are the sets of ideas that are in the wider public's head about who washerwomen are? But then doing research on Sarah, I was able to find her in the manuscript census and really critically read her interview across the grain to see more stuff that I don't think she meant to sort of leak through. And I was able to sort of see what she kept to herself, what she valued, what she didn't want to tell her, and really see the power of a woman raising her family, building basically a small entrepreneurship in her yard, facing a world where laundresses are going away because of automation in the 1930s and 40s is just beginning. But really her resistance, her
Mhm.
independence, where she comes from. She happens to come from the exact same place as my elders in Georgia, Elbert County, Georgia, which is a place that is not that big. So it was pretty amazing to find a great interview with a person who was connected to my ancestors. And so I actually spoke to one of Sarah's descendants in the process of working on this book because she could see me on Ancestry, and I opened up her family tree for her because she hadn't been able to get back that far. And so she's such a powerful reminder of the depth that's present with everybody.
So can you just talk about, and I love that you frame the washerwomen and Sarah around the power that they had to work at their own homes, to set their own time, to set their own pace, and how they resisted and protected their daughters, how they protected themselves. I think was such a powerful conversation that you're having around not work like here we are in 2023, you got forced to work from home, right? The pandemic put us in that spot.
Yes.
But they understood that working from home was protection.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So to be in your own yard was not an ultimate protection, right? You know, someone could still break in and still attack you, but it provided a layer and a barrier. It gave them community. They could work collectively. They could lighten each other's loads. They could watch each other's children. They could raise their children. At my first book talk yesterday, a man came up to me and he said, my great grandmother was a laundress, and she I remember waking up from my naps and seeing her ironing things. And he's like, I now know she did that job because of me, so that she could be with me and take care of me. And that was a choice that she made to prioritize me. He's like, I never knew until I heard this story. I never thought about it. Yeah. And so the chance to prioritize their own children over other people's children was a really powerful one. And statistically, you could find that women are choosing, when they have children, to step away from traditional domestic work and into being washerwomen, just precisely to care for their own.
Did you say in the book on page 84, almost 86% of Black working women in Athens, Georgia, were washerwomen? Like that is, but to take that and to say, here's what they economically have, how they can drive the economy, how they can be breadwinners in their own homes. It's just an unbelievable thing.
And they knew what a monopoly was.
That's right.
And so, you know, oftentimes we think, oh, well, you have to teach people like what their power. They knew right off bat what their power was, and they understood it innately. They understood it at the very first moment of freedom. And so it's a powerful reminder that you don't have to raise the consciousness of folks or teach folks how to think about the world. They understand.
So let's go to Atlanta, a history that I didn't even know. You talk about the washerwomen strike of 1881.
Oh, you didn't know about that?
Here in Atlanta.
Yes, absolutely. There's a beautiful book by Tara Hunter, which I call my Bible. Yeah. Called To Joy My Freedom. And she chronicles that history and so much of the style of the kind of history that I wanted to write coming up. And she gave me a real guide for how I might think about my first book. A way to look at events that aren't necessarily documents about Black people, but you could still find them down inside, and if you knew what you were looking for. And so she writes about and really uncovered that strike. But what I uncovered, because that strike's been in my mind, and as I sat down to write this chapter, I was like, oh Lord, I am stupid for saying I would do washerwomen. There's a whole book about washerwomen. People have already read it. Everyone's heard of that, except for Bettina. And, you know, what do I have to add? And then I realized newspapers.com is a whole different tool than what she had, or what I had even writing Right to Ride, where you had to hand crank, microfiche, reel, and read newspaper by newspaper looking for things. And so there was a limited capacity to find, if you happen to find something cool, but you know, your ability to cover more than a couple years or 3 or 4 years was really hard. But now all of a sudden I could type in washerwomen protest, strike.
Boom.
And it was just, so there were hundreds.
Wow.
There were hundreds of these little micro fights that washerwomen were yielding good results from all over, and including in Athens.
Yeah. And I love that you talk about they had a monopoly. And then there were points where you say people were reporting that they were too cocky.
They were.
Like they wanted their money, they wanted their bread, they wanted their time, they wanted independence. And they would report and call these women too cocky.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just amazing. Like here are Black women demanding what they know they should be paid, and them being reported as too cocky.
There's this weird folk tale called Soap Sally that white people had about laundresses, where Soap Sally like would trap some children and cook them down for their oil and turn that oil into soap and then wash your clothes with your children's oil soap. And I was like, this is the weirdest story I've ever seen. But then it let me know, oh, they're scared.
Mm-hmm.
They're scared of your control, of your independence, that you can make things and generate a whole business from very little. I mean, grease and ash and stuff people threw out turned into a whole business. So yes, of course they're intimidating.
Yeah. And you also say that, and this is part that I can't find in the book, but I underlined it a couple, 2-3 times.
Okay.
Was this idea that the washerwoman let white women have femininity.
Oh, absolutely.
In a particular type of way. Can you talk about that?
Well, I found that this crazy story of a white man after the Civil War who was elderly, but he was washing the clothes of the family that, the enslaved people had left and they were free and they had gone. And so there was no one to wash the clothes. And so he said, rather than, let my daughters experience the shame of washing clothes, I'll do it because we can't get any Black women here. And so white women of any stature who had any money would send their laundry out. It was a shame to have wash lines in their yard. You should be, elevated enough that you didn't do this Negro work. And so it made the laundresses powerful.
Yeah.
That, your whole sense of self was bound up in not doing laundry. That's pretty deep.
That is pretty deep. It's pretty powerful.
I mean, I found their wedding showers where they would present brides with their sheets and they would blacken up and, present the sheets in minstrel washerwomen outfits. It's very funny the degree to which there is this sort of like, this is what's, white and feminine and acceptable, and this is this other. But it's powerful the ways in which Black women didn't let that
not at all
undercut what they were doing.
Not at all. So let's move to stories about the Pullman.
Okay, let's go on.
And I was fascinated. You say on page 136, only white male conductors or Black women maids could hold a white woman's passenger hand to help her steadily balance herself. So my man just watched her fall?
You would have to, because if she fell into his arms or something like that.
Death.
Absolutely. Especially in those kinds of spaces, these sort of public transitory spaces where you don't have people to claim you or say you're okay or this and that, the other thing.
But they organized.
Oh man.
So
Did the Pullman porters ever organized? So my mother always talked about, the train jobs as like the best jobs that Black men could have. And she talked about A. Philip Randolph and how powerful he was. And so I was, thrilled to have the chance to sort of go back and look at the history. I think the history has been well written, but what I was trying to capture here is, again, that humanness of how hard it was to work a job where you can't assist a woman if she's falling without fear for your life, that people will call you out of your name every day, all day. And how do you tolerate that? And what does it get to be when it's too much? And you were dependent on tips. And they were dependent on the tropes of racial slavery really being the reason by which they were there in the first place. George Mortimer Pullman, the founder of the sleeping car company, wanted an all Black staff so that he could invoke plantation slavery all over again. And so from that stereotype comes the largest, most powerful Black union in American history. So it's just that reminder that from what you think is an insult and degradation, you can build something strong.
Yeah. No, I mean, you are a historian.
Yes.
But how do you historian different? How you do it differently? Like, how are you why? Like, there's historians and then there's historians. And as you read this book, there's so much love and there's so much care. And you're going to the archive, you're digging in the crates, but you're coming out with something that not everybody's coming out with. How do you do that with this ethic of care and love? And as you read the archives.
So it all really started with the problem of people, you say, well, I'm a historian. And say, ooh, I don't like history. And you're like, great. You come back. But over time, I learned what they didn't like was that stiffer, drier, rigid writing that tells you the same thing, three different examples of the same thing, and then and repeats, yep, that's the way it was done, and it's very formulaic and not interesting or human and so I would ask people, particularly on Twitter, I'll say, well, what is your favorite history book? And generally they'd say the books of people who are not trained historians. And overwhelmingly, it was The Warmth of Other Suns. That was the book that everybody loved. And I was like, well, she's a great, talented journalist who can really write from that evocative place. And so I said, well, why can't we do that work too? And so I really set out to write a book that had that same care and compassion for language, but was really digging in the crates. Like every time I say something, I know that it's true. Like if I said it was a very hot summer when Sarah got married, I looked up the almanac to make sure it was a really hot summer when she got married in Athens. And so I don't kick it. It's not Toni Morrison, where you start with a nugget of history and then you imagine a world, because that's great too.
Right.
But it's the opposite. I'm really trying to build out this infrastructure and then fill it with that tone of imagination.
Speaking of imagination, one of the chapters in the book is on migration and what so many Black folks lost as they left the South. They left their churches and their communities and their families. And you talk about how they had to rebuild. So on page 204, right? Well, starting on page 203, they bonded, not just based on the work that they did, but on what they believed the world should be like. And I love that. Like, they weren't just working to work. They were working because they believed the world could be a particular type of way. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think all of these examples, the washerwomen, the Pullman porters, and in this case, Black women working as maids and coming together, had a sense of responsibility to each other, to a collective, to care for one another, to say, girl, don't take the job with that lady. She's really crazy, and, really make the good help hard to find for certain people, and to tend to one another and be thoughtful and put their nickels together and build a savings club and help your sister when she was sick and give her some funds when she couldn't go into work because there was no safety net. And so to be each other's safety net, they had to imagine something bigger. And that's part of why I like this particular moment in community organizing, is that that's what the work people are doing now. They're not saying, well, these are the givens and you have to do life like this because this is how we've always done life. They're saying, well, how could we do it differently? And how could we imagine differently? And so these women were architects of those kinds of worlds.
Page 204.
Yes.
These women were architects.
I quote myself.
They needed community, so they built it.
Mm-hmm.
They established informal child care networks and raised money for annual picnics and reunions back home. They created the community institutions would nurture and future, including new churches and social organizations. You also talk about like how these women even sent money back home.
Yes, absolutely.
And this chapter for me was really personal because my grandmother was a domestic worker.
Mm-hmm.
So my grandmother worked at a women's shelter in upstate New York, and she cleaned the women's shelter.
Mm-hmm.
But when my grandmother passed away, my grandmother could not read.
Mm-hmm.
But when my grandmother passed away, all her stuff was intact.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was intact.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking and I'm imagining now that it had to be that community because how she had 10 kids.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather was an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
But when she passed away, all her paperwork was intact and this woman could not read.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just envisioning
a sisterhood.
This sisterhood that she had to have.
Yep.
Because that's not like, how was that possible for her?
It's very possible because she had that.
She had to have it. I'm like, I want to go back now. Like, where was her friends? I want to go find them now. You know, Miss Rosetta, because I gotta imagine that she had this unbelievable. But I was a little kid, so I don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking like, and her church, of course.
Yes.
My grandmother went to church 18 days a week, so I know it had to be church.
Mm-hmm.
But that structure that you talk about is just so powerful in the book, particularly the maid and the homecoming and the things that they were working for. If this book was, let's say, to be a documentary, because I see it as that, I'm reading it as that. These are stories. These are beautiful, beautiful people. What would be things that would have to be to tell the story of the Black working class that you've laid out? What are the moments in history that have to be in that 90 minutes?
And it's an interesting thing because, you know, my moments in here are not necessarily like the moments of history, but they are the moments of this story. And I think they're symbolic of the moments that happen to lots of different people. I was really struck. I talk about a place called Accomack County, Virginia, where my father's ancestors were enslaved. And in the process of researching Accomack, I found an attack on two young Black men who were college educated, but then they came home to organize the community, and they were forming a labor organization of sorts and helping the Black workers and Black agricultural workers and sharecroppers set up a set of rules that they could all follow and assert. And they also were working with women to say that they did not want to work on Sundays and do domestic care. And so we can, you know, I don't have records of them as an organization, but I can see in the responses what they were visioning. They also had their own Black fair. They weren't allowed to attend the all-white county fair. So these two men founded a fair and, you know, had places for people to come together to learn from each other, to learn different farming techniques and have festivities and get together and come from all these rural little places where oftentimes people were a little bit more atomized. And they were attacked. They were shot at. They were accused of shooting at other people. They were banished from the town. They burned the newspaper and the grocery store they held. The grocery store was an important institution for helping that working class community buy food at fair prices and break the chain of dependency on sharecropping and break poverty. And so they were really making a difference. And so they were taken out of that community in a really particular way. So that story was a story no one in my family knew about. I found it, a little clipping of it from the time period in the picture on Ancestry from the maid Minnie, who I trace from Accomack County. And so someone in her family did know about it. And I've run into a few people from the county who was like, yeah, I kind of heard. It was like a small little riot. But when you think about it in terms of the working class, it was enormous, and could tell you something about why my grandfather was like, okay, I have to migrate. I'm not going to have a fair shake here.
Yeah.
But that when he left, he took with him the skills he built there. And I talk about his love of farming. He would make my father go with him to South Jersey on a bus every Saturday morning before dawn to work on land that he was borrowing from another person from Accomack County who he did not know when he was there, but they were part of this conversation and community. And so he had my father working sweet potatoes and so my father just was like, oh God, like he was like, 14, did not want to go on a bus. And they would grow these sweet potatoes and he would cultivate them from the slips that he grew himself. And he would enter the potatoes in prize contests for largest and most beautiful potatoes. And he would harvest them. Oh, excuse me. He would harvest them at the end of the year and then give them all away to the North Philadelphia neighborhood where he lived. And my father would be like, you could be selling these. And they never sold. He's like, people need to eat. And so the ethic that he got from his grandfather and from the skills he built in Accomack, he brought to Philadelphia, of all places. He had a victory garden during the war. It's all these things that were powerful that he brought with him. So oftentimes when we talk about migration, we're talking about running and what they don't have and terror. And those things are true, but they also have things. They also bring things. And they also have something to share with the world.
Wow. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So I know we're getting close to time before we open it up for questions, but I want to talk about today. And so you kind of end the book bringing us to COVID, essential workers, and the Black working class now. And I'm thinking about page 269. More than 28% of the 42 million Black people in America today, the majority of the Black working class are the essential workers. During the height of the pandemic, they were not allowed to shelter in place. Instead, they would be the people who would made the quarantine possible for the white middle class and the wealthy. They would process the food, stock the shelves, drive the buses, box the Amazon purchases, deliver the packages, Instacart the groceries, bring the mail, nurse the elderly, clean the hospitals, and gather the dead. Any appreciation they received did not come in the form of hazard pay, paid sick leave, or medical care. At all, the deaths were largely their fault. They were responsible. The nation effectively told them for their unhealthy diets while living in food deserts, the poison already coursing through their veins due to the tainted groundwater, the smoke already choking their lungs. This current story is an old one.
Absolutely. I was writing the book during the pandemic. And so to think about essential workers, and not to say that all essential workers were Black, but there were many Black people who were essential workers. And, people were like, it's just, being at home. And, I'm at church with a bunch of people like, I was never off.
Yeah.
I'm a CNA. I was never off. I work in the supermarket. I was never off. I'm a postal worker. I was never off. And they figured it out and tried to survive and tried to live before we even had vaccines. And it was a reminder of the research I had done on my grandmother in the migration and her family. And she lost a number of family members to tuberculosis along the way. And we often don't take the time to stop and say, as strong as people are, not everybody even survives. And so I think, to mark the toll that Black workers take to keep the rest of us comfortable is an important thing to note too.
So you start the book with your grandmother.
Mhm.
And you
With
end
my
the-
grandfather.
With your grandfather,
Hmm.
and you end the book with your grandmother.
Yes.
Why?
Well, I never know how to start or begin anything. And there's pictures at the
The
very
family
end,
reunion?
at the family reunion.
Page 273.
So let me tell you about God or the ancestors or
Okay.
both. So I was working on the conclusion, and I had like this. I had the beginning part about my grandmother and about tuberculosis, and I didn't know like where to land it. And I got an email from a woman who said, "There's a box here." I had just moved, and she said, "There's a box here, and it seems important." And something in me told me not to just take it back to the post office and hope it gets to you, but that I should try to figure out who you were. So I looked you up and I saw you were, on faculty. And so I found, she's like, "So I hope this isn't creepy, but I want you to have your box." And so when I went and got the box, it was these pictures in it.
Wow.
And from my cousin who had said like a year ago at that point that she was going to send me some pictures and some of the things that she cleaned out of my cousin's house. And I guess when she finally remembered, she just put it in the mail and didn't realize that I had moved. But that intervention of making sure I had it was a really powerful one. So I was like, well, clearly they want these pictures in the book.
Yeah.
And so that's why I started and ended with them, that they were able to survive. They were able to build the thing that should have been theirs all along. That they were able to have a vision of what was possible by, keeping going and doing the best they could under sometimes unthinkable circumstances.
And what did they instill in you?
Oh boy. Well, that, I have a duty to my community, but I should also have love and care for my community. Like I said, I am a deaconess, and not that deaconesses do anything anymore, but
Not the shame.
but I'm of service, and I love to be of service in my community. I love to raise my children in a way that lets them know that all Black people have dignity and value and have something to say. And for me, putting them in spaces where they can see that in action, they can love and care for people and be loved and be cared for by people from all stations of life is so powerful to me. And so they are. And that's the work. That's the work. I am their descendant.
Yeah. And you say that, right? You close with that. But before we get to, because I love that you end with this idea that that's what you inherited. Talk about your grandmother and her holding your hand.
Oh, yes. So I begin the closing chapter by talking about my grandmother's handhold, which was like incredibly tight. So when I was in her yard and I was chilling, she would just let me run everywhere, and I'd be watering her marigolds and her strawberries and, picking the vegetables that she wanted me to pick and just having a good time. And then when we would go out somewhere, she would take me to get milkshakes, malted milkshakes that she really loved. But she would take my hand and she would just do like this the whole time. Like the little wide part, which is very painful if you squeeze it. And I was a little tiny person, and she was a full grown person with decently strong hands. And so she would just be working it like dough. And I'm like, and so I'd be trying to pull away from her and get away from her handhold. And she would hold tighter if you did that. So I learned to just sort of just submit and let her do that. And so I started thinking about her young life and her experience of all of this as, a kind of anxiety that she experienced from the trauma of leaving South Carolina, leaving North Carolina, losing her grandparents, her parents, her sister closest in age, who I never heard of until I found her in the census. She died of TB in the sanatorium in North Carolina, along with her husband and 2 children. They all died, and she stood at her wedding. And so I never heard her call that name, Cordy May. And so I started to think, well, she's worried that I'm going to be here. And she was worried that I would survive. And she, so just the testimony of her life is both that difficulty and that joy and that freedom.
All right. Before I cry, can we?
No crying.
Can we close out with you reading 274 to the end to 275 when you just bring it home?
The full paragraph.
Yep. Go
Okay.
ahead.
On that land,
Yep.
they hosted big family reunions where all sides of the family came together and celebrated. The descendants of Solicitor and Preston, and even folks from my father's side representing Bruce, met in the summer for food and fellowship. I recently inherited a photo album with images of one of the last reunions in New Jersey, faded photos of pictures of sweet tea next to platters of sliced pound cake. Folks seated in folded chairs pulled up to picnic tables, covered in flowered tablecloths, heads tilted over plates or back in laughter, big straw hats shielding grandmothers from the sun, along with blue tarps strung across the wide yard, Cadillacs of every color parked in the grass out front, folks leaning over in conversation in postures of, remember when? Framed by tall oaks and pines in the yard. Sips of the adult drinks that I wasn't allowed to taste, dipped out of buckets into paper cups. All the men and then all the women posing together. My grandmother and her siblings in their white and yellow, smiling so hard you can't see their eyes. My mother, head turned away from the camera, looking just like me. My grandfather sitting with his 3 surviving siblings, all of whom escaped on a wagon in the dark that night, more than 50 years later, captured in that bright light, with an inheritance all their own.
The roots of the Black working class. All right. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
My understanding that we're going to take questions from the audience and then shift to the folks who are at home. So if you have a question, here's a microphone. Let's go. Come on. We have Regina Bradley.
Hey there. Hey, everybody. So I've been telling folks neater on Twitter because I've been reading it first. But I'm not a historian. I feel like we both have to do that too. I'm not a historian, but I'm really invested probably in kind of some of the work that I'm currently doing about connecting the history to the actual storytelling. You talked about this a little bit, but I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about it in terms of how did you make sure that the storytelling was still accessible without losing the historical, like the rigor of the research, right? Like some folks will give you good history and it's dry, like Pop-Tart bread. Or they'll give you great storytelling, but they give you great storytelling, but it's focused on only just like the entertainment value, so to speak. So I'm wondering, how did you achieve that balance, especially in the stories that you told, to give your larger historical argument?
So for me, thank you for your question. It's a good one. For me, I love writing. I love words. I wrote poetry in undergrad and decided I couldn't be a poet because I figured I would be unsuccessful and hungry. But I adored language, and so the care that one could take with language. I took 2 courses with Rita Dove at UVA, and the things that she taught me about writing are here, right? So she was talking about poetry, but she was a researcher. And so when she talked about things in poetry that were historical, she did archival research and then rendered them into these little tiny, carefully chosen sets of words. And so it was always a powerful lesson to me. And I told some of those stories in poetry in undergrad. I talked about my mother seeing FDR's body go by on the train, which I include in the book. And that was a poem I wrote in that course. So for me, the language is a joy. And so I always got punished for that, like under traditional historical. So like when I write an article for something, they're like, can you just explain like what you're trying to argue here and take this, descriptive part out? And can we rearrange it? And I had some colleagues that like made fun of the way I had written sort of lyrically or rhythmically in the first book. And so I thought, well, here I am with Liveright Norton, where that's the task. And so it was exciting for me to lean into that in a way that I had never been empowered to do so before. But I'm also really obsessed with history and the work of history. So I love knowing what happened. So I'll spend enormous amounts of time knowing something really basic. Like, I couldn't go to Athens during the pandemic. And so I Google mapping and like sliding down streets and looking at the way the houses look and looking at the way the yards are. And so finding Sarah's actual yard and her actual house and her brother's house and the church they went to, and sort of mapping the neighborhood and saying, okay, well, here are the things. And so none of that's in the book per se. It's in the footnotes or endnotes. But like I care about those things being true. Because if I read something beautiful in someone's book and they're like, the light was sparkling through, they were thinking about, and I turn to the endnotes and I'm like, well, how do you know that? You don't. It's not in the note. It's like just something you pulled down. And so I want people to be able to say, well, she didn't just pull it down. She researched it. And so that sort of double, like I want there to be a book you can read in the endnotes that's interesting. And because I read the endnotes, like when I get a brand new history book, I read the endnotes first to know how you said improved what you said you were going to improve. Like I care about that's the meat of the book for me. And so I had to make sure the meat was there, but I also had to make it pretty. And having an editor that cared about that, like, I mean, it was amazing. I would send it back and he's like, well, the story arc needs to really pull a little bit more. I'm like, story arc, pull? Okay. And so it was a great relationship that I had with Dan, who's really good at this too. So he pushed me to finish ideas, to say things plainly. There's a paragraph in the book where I basically am saying, it's racial capitalism, y'all. And I knew I couldn't say it's racial capitalism. So I had to like deconstruct racial capitalism in a set of sentences about the human condition. And I think that exercise, that has been fun and good for me and what I wanted to achieve in the book.
Is this on? Okay, yes, it is. Hi. So a big part of the working class has always been jobs at the post office, which, I think like Hollywood Shuffle and the grandmother telling them there's always jobs at the post office.
Yes.
And so I'm up to the Pullman Porter chapter when you're talking about the union, and there's like haven't gotten to it yet, but can you talk about the how that union might have led to, if I read correctly, to the post office, how those two were connected?
So they aren't necessarily, but they're intertwined into a network of people. If we look at the modern civil rights movement, the people who could tolerate the economic reprisals of their local communities in order to organize, they needed to be federal employees, not state employees. So like regular teachers were really targeted if they stepped up. So it's like a person like Septima Clark who got fired immediately. So you would lose your job for organizing. So to be a postal worker, Amzie Moore, who's a postal worker in Mississippi, goes to DC and gets his job back because he's like, no, you're not going to do that. I'm not hired by you local people. I'm hired by the federal government. So there was a power there as a veteran and as a postal worker. And so the Pullman Porters also had a certain degree of independence. It was not as complete. And of course, the Pullman Company was very adamant in breaking up the union and did fire lots of people. But during the modern civil rights movement, the presence of Pullman Porters was really powerful. So we know that the main organizer of the Montgomery bus boycott in the wake of Rosa Parks' resistance was a Pullman Porter. And so that mobility, that network, that knowing lots of people, postal workers and Pullman porters have incredible eyes on whole communities because moving around is part of the job. And so I think that's the connection for me.
There's a strike or a potential strike at UPS, and there was an important strike at Amazon. Those have been led by pretty young, mostly Black men, and so I'm wondering if, when you're thinking about the history of organizing, building on those things, do you see these contemporary labor movements as taking lessons, or do you feel like people are like either directly taking lessons and studying, or do you feel like people are doing their own thing in this time and kind of moving intuitively within their own work?
I think there's something in the water of Black existence that enables you to see things critically, that young people come into. And I know, a lot of younger workers are like, we're very, not your grandmother's movement kind of thing. And in terms of like a politeness. But in terms, I mean, they might be surprised at like what their grandmother was really like if they really knew how resistant so many previous generations were. So I do think that the questioning of assumptions and the desire for collectivity and the ability to build that and have confidence in the networks that you have already are inflecting current movements. And I see them as, carriers of that longer legacy. Absolutely.
Hi,
Hey.
I am a historian and I'm also dissertating. And much like you, I write about women that aren't considered as important in secondary literature. And so I guess my question is more methodological. Like, what's your advice for historians that are studying women, particularly in archival research, who aren't necessarily the focus of the archive?
When are Black women the focus of the archive? I think reading through the documents that we have is such a powerful tool. I mean, I don't think I think there's a few interviews in here that are, more contemporary, done in the 1980s or 1990s, the work I did. But then a lot of those earlier interviews, they weren't meant to be read this way. And they really weren't. They've been used before. Like Be the Washerwoman Sarah's story has been cited before, but never used in this sort of personal kind of human way. So for me, the layering of documents enables me to know a little bit more about what I'm looking at. So I'll make a map, I'll Google map stuff, I'll look at the phone book, I will look for church memberships, I will look, I make a network. And that may not be like what I'm writing about, but knowing about people in context is so key for me. And then I think it's also what Elsa Barkley Brown called like ways of knowing and honoring that there are things that you're going to know and recognize from life experience. And you can read that into those documents too, that you can read, the memories of these previous generations and the ways that your elders thought about or framed things as also valid, that we don't have to have just the archive, and if it's not written down by someone hostile to us, then it's not valid. You're welcome.
So we always like to recognize that all books are kind of built on the ancestors, other books. And you shouted out a few folks that were influential for you. But if somebody is just starting out wanting to understand labor history, and particularly Black labor history, are there some books that you would like to recommend?
Well, Black folk.
Number one. We're gonna make sure people walk out of here with it.
I'm teasing. So for me, Tara Hunter's work, which I already mentioned, To Join My Freedom, the work of Robin Kelley, everything he's written is just so informative of thinking about that texture. Race Rebels, for example, was really the first time I saw someone sort of trying to unpack a bus. Like what are people doing on a bus? Like he's reading, some arrest records against newspapers, and he's telling you like what it was like on this whole new terrain. And so his work it was and is a guide. And I think, I could consider them the parents together of, me being able to do this kind of work at all. I think there's really, there's pressure because, I'm at the age where I forget people's names and books, but I definitely could put together a list because I think there's a lot of really beautiful work going on around this. But in certain ways, I feel like I'm writing a little bit alone in this moment with these particular sets of questions. And so particularly around community and working life. So I could put together a list if I had to meditate, but when I'm writing books, I use the most unappetizing books to write those books. Like a book from 1942, Negro characteristics of the such and such worker. Like, I can't recommend that.
That's why you make it accessible for other people.
Yes.
Bettina, I'm gonna give you the last word. Take us out. You got any?
Benediction?
Yeah.
I didn't know that was coming, but I just want to say thank you.
Thank you
for the love and care that you told these stories with. I felt as though I was learning a little bit more about my family.
Mm-hmm.
I was learning a little bit more about my grandmother. And I was learning a little bit more about how I became who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And I think oftentimes, and this speaking personally, our grandparents and parents didn't talk about these things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's do the work, go to your job. Why you complaining?
Yeah.
But to see the type of dignity that I knew they had, but I didn't have the words to articulate that.
Yes.
To see the type of commitments they had to each other, the love that they had for each other, and how they were able to build something for me, something for my kids. That was not just about passing down wealth.
Yes.
They passed down a different type of wealth to us. And
yes.
I think you articulated that so brilliantly in this book. So I'm grateful that you wrote something so loving, so kind about what we would think of just mundane, everyday people just working. But you made it a story like no other. So I think the archive was speaking, you were listening, and you were able to translate that to us in such a beautiful way. So thank you for this book.
Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Buy the book. You at home? Buy the book. You got a code, ER? What's the code?
We're gonna click this teal button at the bottom center of your
You know,
screen.
like
If you're
the
watching with us, you can buy a copy. We will have signed copies as long as supplies last. So go ahead and secure your signed copy now by clicking this teal button. We're gonna say thank you and good night to all of y'all watching with us. We really do appreciate it when you tune in virtually. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.